Well, it's 28 degrees this morning, but I come out here early and turn the heat on for an hour or so to warm it up a little bit. I'm getting ready to caulk in this hold the deck joint here on this Com-Pac 16. I didn't film it, but I recorded it. But I cleaned out, when I cleaned out this joint here, I went back over it with a drill with a brass wire brush, and just cleaned it out really good. With that, that does a pretty good job of getting all the little loose particles out and just getting it kind of clean. And but just want a word of caution: these things are really notorious for breaking off strands of the brass wire and slinging it out. So make sure if you want to use one of these things to use a minimum of safety glasses. Even a face shield is even better, because they will get you, and they could potentially put your eye out or something. So, but anyway, they do work pretty good, but you do have to be careful with them because they lose bristles, the little wire bristles. But anyway, I did that. I cleaned it with acetone good, that kind of thing. Got it all nice and clean, all the old adhesive off of it for the tape that was on it and all that. So like I said, I've got underneath the chain plate here taped off so that when I force that caulking all up in here and behind all this and all, if it runs out the bottom there, that won't make quite such a mess. I've got my rub rail taped off at both ends to try to keep the caulking off of that for a little less cleanup. And so I think I'm good to go. What I'm caulking this with, and I don't use this very often on boats, but occasionally, but it's the 3M 5200, and that is what I choose to use on this joint here. I want something that's as strong of a bond as I can possibly get, but still be flexible. And I have found that this works good. I've been using this for doing this specific job here for probably 35 years, and 30 years anyway, and it's always done a good job. And I haven't had any come back on me to have to refix. So, and I've fixed a bunch of them. But I've got this joint cut out a minimum of a ½ inch deep, sometimes 3/4 of an inch deep. In a few places I actually went all the way through, but where it was kind of a void there anyway. And it just went all the way through, which is all good. I'll be pumping it in that crack there as best I can. I'll use a screwdriver here to just kind of help me open that up just a touch to get it in there a little better, because I want to try to make sure I'm getting pumped back in there as far as possible, and then I'll kind of mount it over this outer edge as well, so that it's bonding to top and bottom lip there on that fiberglass, and then I'll put the white duct tape over it, and then I'll heat this rub rail up and put it over that while the caulking is still wet. This is the slow cure, the original slow cure 5200. The fast cure will work too. You just don't have quite as much time to get it all back together. Most of the time I use the fast cure, and I had some of this 5200 slow cure, so that's what we'll use. And I quite often have to use my fingers to press it in and smooth it out or whatever, and I usually just don't worry about gloves with this stuff. It's just easier to do it with my fingers, and then I just clean my hands up afterwards. And denatured alcohol does a pretty good job of cleaning this up. Acetone would work as well, but it is still chilly out here. Now, in addition to just cutting a kind of a small tip here, I'm also going to flatten that tip out. I'm going to just take some pliers or vice grips or something and just flatten it together here to make it a better nozzle for getting down inside that crack there. So I'm going to do that real quick. So you can see there, I just kind of flatten that tip out a bit, and that'll help me, guide that caulking in that crack a little better. It actually kind of fits in that crack in a lot of places. Some places it'll be too tight, and I just have to kind of work with it. But anyway, it's not rocket science. It's just it's just caulking. But I do want to try to get it squeezed up in there as absolutely as far as I can. That's kind of the key, and it seals it to keep water out, but it also bonds the two, the deck and the hull together with a pretty strong joint. This flexible, so if you do bump the dock hard or something, there's a good chance that it'll flex and not separate and start leaking again. I do take and put a little bit of the caulking around the top of these screws. Like right now I've got some excess that I got to deal with here, so I just went ahead and just to try to make sure that no water leaks around these bolt heads or screw heads. Pretty easy to make a bit of a mess trying to force it in that crack good. And then I just use my finger to mound it over the joint, top and bottom, and just try to make sure it's squeezed in there good. When I put my tape over this, that will kind of force the caulking further up into the crack, because the way I do my tape, it just kind of puts a little pressure on that caulking to push it even further in. And I'll worry about this last 6-8 inches out here at the end and sometime in the future, not in the middle of the winter when it's so cold. Trying to make sure that it's bonded to that whole surface, that whole outer surface there, and kind of round it out on it to give me some excess to squeeze in to the crack better. And I'm making a bit of a mess here, but this. And I usually work my way up about to the chain plate, and then I'll stop and I'll clean all this up and put my tape on it to keep it from dripping and running out, and then I'll do the front half. Because it's pumped in under pressure, so it's going to want to try to squeeze back out. And I just use that excess that's squeezing out to just kind of mound up an outer little bead here to make sure I've got adhesion to top and bottom flange there. And that flange has been, sanded and cleaned with acetone and everything. It's real clean glass, de-waxed and all that. So this stuff will bond to it really good. And like I say, whenever I come back and put my tape on it, that captures that blob of adhesive on that edge and kind of pushes it back into the crack. That's looking pretty good there so far. It makes a mess. About squeezing the tip of that caulking gun, I've got a nozzle that more or less fits up inside that crack to push that caulking up in there again. So I can put as much pressure in there as I want to make sure it's full. Yeah, I've got it on down to the chain plate, and that'll be a temporary stopping point. And I'll come back and smooth this back out like I want, and then go ahead and put my duct tape on this area just to keep this under control. This slow setting 5200 has a tendency to, of course, all of it really does. Vertical surface like this, it has a tendency to try to run a little bit. I had a spot down here where it got on the hole, so I was just trying to clean that off a bit. This is Gorilla Tape, and I honestly don't usually use Gorilla Tape, but I'm going to use it on this one because I've got it. I usually use the 3M tape, but any of it will work. Like I say, the main thing this tape is for is just to cover up the wet caulking so that you can continue to work and put your rub back on. It really is just very temporary kind of thing. And I just go right over that where I caulk the top of the bolt heads there. I just go right across the top of that. In a minute I'll fold that under and capture that bead of caulking. And I'm staying just shy of that inside radius, and that lets it lap underneath the bottom good, and doesn't show when you put your rub rail back on. The Gorilla Tape is thicker and it doesn't conform to your curve as easy, but it works just as good. Any of them will work. have that run up to my chain plate, just sealing it nice and tight across that top. Good. And I'll have a little bit of squeeze out around those bolt heads up in here. I'll clean that off in a little bit before I put my rub rail on. I actually clean that off. And then I just take and kind of pull it down nice and hard and stick it underneath. And that just does a pretty good job of squeezing that caulking back up in that crack good. And I come back with my hand and just kind of seal it good. This is where having that lip real clean comes in handy, because that duct tape will stick real good if it's good and clean. Just kind of go down that little lip there to get that caulking pushed on in there nice and tight. Now I do have a bit of squeeze out where I had put a blob of caulking over those bolts, and so I'll go ahead and clean that up right now. Don't usually have squeeze out on the bottom. Once in a while. Up good. Once in a while, your tape, when you get it where you want it at the top, will end up being a little bit too long at the bottom, and once in a while I may have to take a razor knife and trim off a little excess tape on the bottom here and there. Most of the time I don't have to, but once in a while. Depends on how wide that flange is. Sometimes that flange is skinnier than other times. But if you have excess tape underneath there, it can show underneath your rub rail. So if it's hanging down too far, you just want to trim it off. That may not have shown, but no, I know it won't. Okay, now I'm going to do the front section, and then I'll come back at the end and clean up my chain plate area there a bit. So you can see there kind of how it looks. You can tell where the bolts are at every 6 inches or so. And that's ready for the rub rail to go back on that part. I've got to do some cleanup here. I really went overboard on the caulking right here around this chain plate to make sure I had it pushed back up in there really good, because I needed to fill in that void behind it up in there real good. So I've got a bunch of excess coming out, but I'm gonna clean this up a little bit, make that look a little better, a little bit, and see what we got then. And I'm getting ready to do this front part. The heat was not on last night, so it got down to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So this rub rail is going to be very, very, very cold, and it's going to be shrunk some. You see how tight it is there. So I'm going to heat it with my heat gun and warm it up good for a bit from one end to the other, and get it a little bit more pliable before I put it on. Just so I don't crack it. I don't think it would crack, but still, it's just easier to work it if it's warm. So that's the next step. I've got everything caulked on this side, the port side here, and I've got the taped over everything. You know, the caulking's still wet. That excess caulking that was beaded out there has been, pushed back into that seam good, and got all my excess drips or whatever cleaned up. And like I said, while this caulking is still wet, you want to put your rub rail back on it. That way you don't have any places where the rub rail won't fit because of hard caulking that it's not shaped like it needs to be shaped. So when you put this rub rail around that, it kind of shapes that bead of caulking right there, kind of around it, and puts pressure on it to push it into that crack. Anyway, it's been working for me. And then this summer, if I choose to do the very end, all you got to do is take out the bolt and pop off that rub rail for a foot, and you can do that last 6-8 inches. But not usually a problem. It does not usually leak for me. I wear old clothes and old shoes when I do stuff like this, because inevitably you're going to get it on you somewhere. I've got it on my pants already. I dripped bilge paint on my shoes the other day. Takes a little while to warm it up when it's really cold, but it retains the heat pretty good. So once you get it warm, it stays warm for a while. And I've got my heat gun set pretty hot, but not hot enough to melt this stuff. If you get it too hot, you'll put a burnt place in it, and it turns like shiny if you overheat it. But by leaving the ends bolted and not taking it completely off, it keeps me from having to put a come along or something on this thing and stretch it back out and fight it to get it back in place. In the middle of the summertime, out in the sunshine, it's not that big a deal, but in the wintertime, it's cold. If you disconnect it and take it completely loose, it shrinks up like a foot too short, and you have to stretch it, and it's really hard to do when it's cold. So that's why I leave the end bolted and don't worry about that last 8 inches down there. It's just not that big a deal. Now I'm able to just push it on with my hand there. By warming it up, I was able to just push it on with my hand and not even have to hit it with a block of wood and a hammer or a mallet or anything. It just easily went on. I'll have a little bit of cleanup to do when I get done, completely done, but not much. So now it's stretched out long enough to fit nicely. And I've got on my hands, so I'm getting it here and there. I have to clean it up. So other than just a little bit of cleanup, that side's done. That's how I typically do them in the wintertime. And like I say, I've had real good luck with it. I haven't never had one leak to my knowledge.